Hello folks! This time around I want to take a little bit of a look at process control in Linux and Bash. So again, we've often got lots of programs, lots of processes that are running on a system. We want to be able to monitor the resources they're using and control that to a certain degree. So we'll just have a bit of an experiment with how they can do that today. Alright, so I want to run through some of the theory and just some of the basic ideas first, and then we'll go through and play with a little bit of Linux and actually see this in action. So some of the relevant information that we might want to be able to keep track of for any process that's running might be who's running it, right? What user started the job, how much CPU time it's used, how much memory it's used, what its priority is it running at high priority or low priority, when did it start, what percent of the CPU is actually dedicated to it, all sorts of things that we might keep track of. So to keep track of the processes, every process when it started is given a unique integer ID, and we can refer to the process by that ID as it's running. So lots of the commands that we use are going to rely on knowing that ID. So we'll also take a look at how to find that out. Now, any process might be able to spawn other processes. So for instance, the shell that you're typing commands in, when you type a command, it might spawn another process to go off and run that particular command. Or your program might start other programs. So all sorts of potential places where one process can start another one. So the parent process is the first one, and the child process is the one it starts. Now, it may be the case that the child process is terminated when the parent ends, or it may not. It depends on how the two of them are started up. But we'll play with all this later on. Let's see. So processes can either be active or paused, right? So it might be running and working right now, or we might have temporarily suspended it. And it can either be running in the foreground or in the background. When you're sitting at the terminal typing in commands and the command immediately runs and gives you back some kind of response, it's running in the foreground. It's also possible to say, okay, well, I want to be able to use my shell, my terminal, to interact with the command system, but I want to start something running that continues to run while I'm doing these other things. So you can run something in the background as well. And the way you get something to run in the background is to throw the and sign, the ampersand at the end of the command when you type it in. If you recall, you probably wound up doing this last year at some point, playing with things like gedit in the labs, where we stick this little extra symbol on to say, okay, I want that command to run, but I want to be able to continue interacting with the shell here and now while it's off doing its thing. So in terms of process control, you've probably all used Control-C by now to kill infinite loops and things. So Control-C kills the current foreground process, right? The one that you've got active and running and you're interacting with right now. Control-Z, on the other hand, just pauses it. Doesn't actually kill it, but it makes it stop running temporarily. With our paused program, we can then decide if we want to resume it running, but in the background, or resume it running in the foreground. And so if we type in the commands BG or FG at the terminal, we can move it back and forth between background and foreground. And then there's a whole slew of different ways that you can list the active processes. So PS just gives a quick text list of your processes. The command W for what gives you a list of everybody's processes that are running on the system right now. And a command called top actually gives you the same sort of a list as W as what, but it keeps updating every second or so. So it's an constantly updating list. Now, when we're interacting with the foreground process, we can use things like Control-C and Control-Z to kill it or suspend it, right? We can interact with it directly. But for the stuff that's running in the background, we need some way to communicate with it as well. So for instance, if I want to terminate one of the background processes, how can I do that? And so this kill command is used to send signals to processes. So you specify kill, the process ID, and then what kind of a signal that you want to send. So the -9 is about the most extreme. It's basically the signal that says, okay, actually terminate this process. So kill -9 and some process ID will actually terminate that process. There are a bunch of other signals you can send, but we won't worry about those for now. And again, you can use PS to look up the process ID, or top or W to look up the IDs of the processes that are running right now, and then decide which one it is you want to send a signal to. Each of the processes has a priority from 0, which is really, really high priority, to 19, which is really, really low priority. And how much CPU time a process gets is based on its priority. And you get this kind of round robin idea where all of the active processes get a little chunk of the CPU time, and then they're paused, and another process runs for a little tiny fraction of time, and then the next one gets its turn. And this 0 to 19 basically just determines how much of a chunk of the CPU they get when it's their turn. Now, if you've got something that's really CPU intensive, and there's a whole bunch of people on the system, and you really don't want to bog the system down for everybody, you can deliberately run whatever that process is at a lower priority. And this is done by putting the nice command in front of it. So you say nice, and whatever your big, slow, ugly command is, and it runs it at a lower priority. I think by default it runs it at priority 4, or is it priority 10? But it runs it at a lower priority than normal, just so you're not bogging down the system quite as much. And again, the handful of commands that are used for monitoring your processes, PS, top, and W, are probably the 3 that you'll use the most. And we'll experiment with each of those. And then the other thing that I'll just mention before we dive in and start playing with it is the time command. So time will come back, time will run your command and come back and tell you how long that command took to run. So it'll tell you how much CPU time it took, how much time it was actually in control of the CPU while it was running, how much real time, and how much system time it used. So how much of the actual system calls was it using while it ran. So we'll play with a bit of this stuff and see how it goes here. So again, the idea is we can go through and show the processes that we've got running right now. And you can see it tells you what the name of it is. So bash is this shell script that I'm entering commands in. Apparently I had something running in the background there. We'll play with that in just a second. PS is, of course, the command that I just typed in, and it's got the process ID and what connection it was using. You can get more detailed information with the W or what command. And again, here you see a lot more information. Who's running it, where they're connecting from, when they logged in, how long they've been idle, what job CPU they're using, what command they're running right now. Right, you can see me down there running W. So you can get a bit more detailed snapshot of what's going on the system right now using what. Or you can get an updating version of that called top, and it shows you pretty much the same information, but here it sorts it by who's using the most CPU right now. And so you can see which users are chewing up CPU time right now, which command it is they're running that's doing that, how much memory they're using, right? What percent of the CPU, what percent of memory they're using. So you can get a lot of information about what's running on the system right now. All right. So if we want to experiment with some of the other bits and pieces we were talking about here, let's say that I run files that I got floating around here. Let's say I want to use less to look at the contents of my new file. So again, this is running in the foreground. And then I decide, I want to temporarily suspend this. So I do my Control-Z, and you can see it comes back and tells you that, okay, I've temporarily stopped this program from running, this command from running. So if I do my PS, we can see I've got a second less. Apparently I was doing this earlier and left a less running. So I can see which processes are out there and active right now. I can take that stopped less and move it into the foreground with the FG command. And I'm back to looking at my file. So now I'm just going to quit less regularly. And hopefully now we're just down to one of them running in the background. Right. And again, we've got these process IDs that we can work with. I mentioned the kill command. Let's just terminate that extra less that I had running. So I send the kill-9 to the 18446, and that kills the other process that was running. So there we go. We're down to just the shell that I'm working in and the command that I actually typed, the PS command that I typed. So you can play with a lot of this stuff as you're going along. Again, if I want to do something like, let's do my new file, but run it in the background. Right, so it fires that process up, so it's actually running, but it's running off in the background someplace. And again, if I do a foreground to bring it forward, I get my less up and running, and I'll just quit normally. So you can have a lot of fun playing with this stuff, right? Just controlling what's going on. If you need to kill a process that's running someplace, this is one way to do it. And again, you can use the PS command to get the process ID and other information for it. We mentioned things like the time command. So if I do something like time ls, it comes back and tells me how much actual real or clock time it used, how much CPU time it used, how much system time it used. So we get a bit of a breakdown of what's going on there. And again, if I want to run something at a lower priority, I just use the nice and whatever the command is. And it goes off and runs it at a reduced priority. And again, if you think back to the run of top that we did earlier, it does show you what priority something is running under. So that second column there. All right, I think that's just about everything I wanted to run through for now in terms of process control. We'll come back and play with this stuff in maybe a little bit more detail when we start tackling some of the scripting later.